If you woke up tomorrow in ancient Egypt, chances are you wouldn't survive past sunset. The heat alone would press on your chest like a sleeping lion. The water you reach for might make you violently ill. And the rules, unwritten as the wind and strict as a judge, would tangle your every step. Your name would mean nothing, your language less. By noon, your skin would sting under a sun that polishes stone to a glare. By mid-afternoon, the grit between your teeth would taste like ground bone. And by evening, if you were still standing, the city's gods would want an introduction you don't know how to give. Tonight, you can turn a handle and pour clear water into a glass that clinks with ice. A soft hum keeps the room cool. A light touch brightens the dark. If you feel a fever, a pharmacist a few blocks away knows your symptoms by barcode. In ancient Egypt, water is boiled or brewed because microbes have 1,000 unpronounceable names, and every one of them is hunting you. Shade is a currency. Linen is armor. A scratch can become a sentence. A cough can become a verdict. Your comforts, thermostats, antibiotics, warning labels, are the very things that make you think you could manage. They are also the reasons you could not. This is the story of how people endured without the tools you consider basic. How they ate bread that doubled as medicine and drank beer that doubled as safety. How a reed pen could lift a family higher than a spear. Why eyeliner was more than decoration and calendars were more than dates. We'll follow the river that fed an empire and drowned the careless. Meet the priests who measured time with shadows, and the workers who moved mountains one wet stone at a time. You'll hear how belief stitched fear into meaning, how taxes were counted in grain, and how a single flood could bless a kingdom or starve it. Come closer to the riverbank. Night gathers over the Nile with a slow blue hush. Torches wink alive along a quay of limestone, and the air smells of yeast, smoke, and damp clay. Somewhere, a bronze bell taps the hour. Somewhere, a scribe rattles a jar of ink. A bark slides past, its sail dark against a sky salted with constellations the Egyptians named before your world had a name. The day you would not survive is beginning, and it begins gently, with water breathing against the reed beds and sand cooling underfoot. Dawn comes softly to the Nile, a pale seam stitched between river and sky. The first light slides over limestone like a hand smoothing linen, turning the city's edges gold. Cornices, door lintels, the blunt shoulders of statues that have held still through 100,000 mornings. Air that was cool a breath ago begins to warm, slow and certain. Sand remembers the night, but releases it reluctantly. Smell finds you first. Warm grain swells from courtyard ovens, where women lift lids off clay bellies and slap discs of emmer dough against their inner walls. The scent is toasty and faintly sour, yesterday's leaven waking again, threaded with the faint sweetness of date syrup. There is wood smoke, pale and resinous, wandering in ribbons from brazier to alley, carrying the ghost of cedar or acacia where someone nursed a fire all night. From the river comes the damp green breath of reeds and water mint, a coolness that pools in the hollows of the bank. The kilns at the potter's quarter exhale a darker note, earthen and mineral, as red clay yields to heat and becomes vessel. And somewhere, a jar is cracked open in beer size, yeast and straw, the safe bitterness that keeps the water tame. Sound wakens next, a loose weave tightening. A boy clicks his tongue to urge a donkey along. The wicker panniers creak in rhythm with the animal's hooves. Bronze mirrors ring delicately as they brush one another in a vendor's basket, tiny suns chiming before the big one clears the horizon. On the river, the wet slap of a pole against a boat's flank, the soft suck and release where water kisses the mud. Palm fronds whisper above the rooftops, and the wind carries a scatter of voices, a woman calling for more fuel, a man bargaining for onions, a child reciting a tidy string of numbers learned by heart. At the temple enclosure, a doorbeam thuds as it settles into its stone bed, and then a hush as the first incense of the day takes flame. Doves clatter upward from a ledge, the wing beats as quick as a drummer's hands, then glide back down, cooing. Light spreads and hardens. It finds the chisels left by masons sleeping near their work, glinting at odd angles. It runs down the flutes of a column in the style you could sketch with a single calm line. Papyrus blooming to hold a roof, shadow pooling in the bowl of each carved leaf. In shaded rooms, walls keep their promise. Stone stays cool, almost damp to the touch. Fingers brush across hieroglyphs, incised so cleanly you could mistake them for fresh ink. Owl, water ripple, loaf, each sign a remembered breath. Outside, the sun begins to polish the city in earnest. Whitewashed plaster brightens until you squint. The alleys trap the glare and throw it back. Even the dust looks gilded, turning in the air like shaken flour. Texture belongs to everything. Your feet, shod in leather or woven reeds, feel the street as a slow talk of surfaces. Beaten earth, stray chips of stone, the occasional slick where someone spilled oil. Linen pulls against your shoulders with a small, honest weight. The threads are thick, a little rough at the seams, still cool where dawn clung to them on the line. By mid-morning, they will grow soft with sweat and warmth, clinging like a second skin. A bead necklace rests against the collarbone with the reassurance of a familiar habit. Kohl lines eyes not for fashion alone, but against glare and insects. A thin, silky drag of the stick that leaves a medicinal tingle. When you lean against a wall, the stone's chill travels into your bones like a slow sip of water. The marketplace comes into focus as if a curtain has been lifted. Fish, dull silver and wet, fan their fins in shallow trays. Green bundles of fresh-cut papyrus stand bound like bouquets. Baskets of garlic and green leeks jab a friendly sharpness into the air. Clay jars are stacked to the waist, their bellies round, their jar scar absently stroked by the potter who made them. A woman threads her way through with a baby on her hip and a string bag of figs on her arm. A scribe passes her, his reed pens tucked into a little roll at his belt, ink cakes rattling in a jar. He nods to a baker who is brushing stray ash from a loaf, then steps around a stray dog asleep in a patch of shade so narrow it seems borrowed. Voices rise and fall, negotiable as price. Hands talk as much as mouths do. 2 fingers to show a measure, a flat palm to indicate enough. At the edge of the city, the fields start like a promise kept. The river is a long, breathing animal, and its banks bloom in the wake of last season's flood. Mud is drawn into neat rectangles by men whose legs are dark with silt to the knee. Women stand ankle deep, pressing seedlings into the cool, wet grid with the same calm, repetitive grace they use to braid each other's hair. An ibis stalks the shallows with professional patience. Somewhere, a herdsman sings songs to his cattle, the vowels long and steady as a plumb line. The smell here returns to the first notes of morning: wet earth, crushed plant, sun-striking water, and adds a soft animal musk, warmed by hide. Behind walls, inside courtyards, another rhythm unfolds. Mortars clap a steady beat as spices are crushed. Coriander, perhaps, or fenugreek, salting the air with their bright green promise. A jar lid lifts, and a handful of dried fish tumbles into a stew thick with lentils. A mother rinses a child's hands with a trickle from a red clay jar, beating the skin with coolness. The child laughs, and droplets glitter for a second before the light reaches them, and they disappear. In a corner, a man strings a new head onto a drum, pulling the wet leather taut and testing the pitch with a gentle tap. A cat, sleek and certain, curls herself into a question mark atop a folded blanket and blinks as if she invented the sun. The city's bones are old, but the morning is always new. Thebes and Memphis both wake like this, one with its memory of kings and tombs carved into the cliffs to the west, the other with quarries and workshops feeding a capital's appetite. On one street, the name is Waset, on another, Men-Nefer. But the day is the same. Lotus shadows on a cistern's rim, sandals scuffing the same threshold smoothed by grandparents and their grandparents. What you call history is simply what they called today. Listen long enough, and the modern hum that follows you, electric, conditioned, exact, thins until it seems very far away, like a line you can still see, but no longer need to cross. The rhythms here are older. The measure of work between cool and heat, the length of shade beneath a wall, the distance you can carry water before your arms complain. The city does not ask you to rush. It does not promise to slow for you either. It moves at the pace of hands and feet and breath. Even the river's voice is patient. A bark noses along the quay, its sail swollen, its ropes ticking softly against the mast. Men on the deck coil fiber like serpents and laugh at a joke you almost understand without the words. Ash drifts up from a brazier and lands on your forearm as a single gray petal. You brush it away and feel the grit on your skin, fine and real. A priest passes with a tray of small offerings, bread, beer, onions, a kiss of incense, headed toward a doorway, shadowed and tall. The smell follows him, warm and smoky and faintly sweet, and for a heartbeat, it is the only thing in the world. This is the bridge, imperceptible at first, then firm underfoot. The morning's scents and sounds and surfaces gather and arrange themselves until you're no longer looking in from the future, but standing there, shoulder to shoulder, with the people who called this place home. The sun lifts fully, the river brightens, and the city opens its eyes wide. Whatever else the day will bring, the work, the bargains, the blessings, it begins here, gently, with bread breaking and water moving, and light that seems to pour from the stone itself. He is called Hori, a name his father says means belonging to Horus, though most days Hori belongs to ink and dust. He lives on the west bank, where the dead sleep in stone and the living build the places where they will sleep. At dawn, he wakes to the scrape of a broom made from palm ribs and the smell of yeast rising. By habit, his first touch is for the little wooden pallet that holds his cakes of ink. One black, one red, the colors of speech and warning. He wets the tip of a reed in a jar and draws a line on the inside of his wrist, just to feel the day become a line he can measure. Merritt, his wife, folds fresh linen over her forearm, a long strip she will wrap and pin at his shoulder. The fabric is coarse at the seams and soft everywhere else, cool for a moment, because night still lingers in its threads. She has already shaped the morning. Bread, domed and split to steam. A jug of beer, tipped to let the yeast settle. a handful of figs pressed flat for the children. Their son, little Kim, is at the threshold with a basket he insists on carrying, though it is nearly as large as he is. Their daughter, Tia, touches the coal stick to Hori's lower lid and laughs when he squints. For the sun, she whispers, solemn as a priest. For the flies, Merritt adds, and taps his cheek with a finger that smells of coriander. He eats with quick, neat bites, tearing bread to dip into a bowl of lentils thinned with water and sharpened with onion. The beer is thick and slightly sour. The first swallow sets his stomach right. On the courtyard wall, the shadow of a pigeon lengthens into the shape of an ibis as the sun climbs, and Hori, who notices shadows, tells Kim to keep the basket out of it so the figs will not warm too quickly. His father, who has spent a life pushing blocks with other men's hands against his shoulder, sits on a low stool and chews slowly. He has the cough he gets every year when the river's water lies heavy and sweet. Merritt has given him honey and a tisane of willow bark, but night is the part of the day that owns him now, and morning is a loan he repays in silence. Hori's work begins where other men's work is counted. He is a scribe to the gang that carves and paints the long corridors of a noble's tomb, somewhere among the folds of the western hills. When he crosses the lane toward the office, a narrow room with a reed mat on the floor and a shelf for ostraca, boys carrying water skins nod the way boys do, their chins lifting as if the sky is light and the ground is not. He thinks of their small bones, quick hands. He thinks of their names, which he must write correctly. In the doorway, the foreman, Nacht, is already scowling at a tablet. The good days, Nacht says without greeting, and the days lost. Set them out cleanly. Inspectors come before the market closes. Days are the measure of everything. Days worked, days sick, days bitten by a scorpion, days when a man must bury a mother, days the chisel cannot bite because mud has swallowed the path. Hori wets his reed and begins to write the names he knows as well as his children's. He writes in black ink the ordinary fact of labor, and in red the changes that burn, tool repairs, replacements, penalties. He copies from yesterday's shards of pottery because nothing is wasted. Broken jars become pages, the unglazed surface good for fine strokes. He pauses to blow gently on a line to keep it from smearing, and the smell of carbon and gum arabic rises, warm and faintly sweet. By the second hour, the heat has arrived politely and asked to stay. Hori's forearm sticks to the edge of the board. Grit nests in the little folds of his linen. Men come and speak names of tools and measures. Adzes, mallets, cubits, hecat of oil, sacks of barley, and he turns their breath into marks. At the doorway, a woman appears with a child on her hip and a jar balanced on her head. Hori knows her, Henu, whose husband is a plasterer with clever hands and a tendency to drink his rations too quickly. My son has fever, she says without hello, in the voice of someone who has gone already to 3 other doors. He shakes even when the shade is cold. Please mark my husband sick for today. He will fetch the mud from the quarry tomorrow, twice if he must. There are rules for everything. Hori thinks of them like cords around a bundle of reeds. They keep the shape true, but you can make a flute only if you loosen 1 or 2. He writes a single red line through the plasterer's name, sets the day aside with a neat symbol that means absence for sickness. Nacht pretends not to see. Later, he will subtract a measure of barley from the family's ration and keep it for the gang's common pot. We have to eat too, Nacht will say, and it will be true. Everything is true, and contradicts itself. By mid-morning, men arrive from the granary to weigh out grain as taxes in kind. The granary itself is a puzzle of rooms and bins. Its walls swell with heat like a man who has eaten well. Intef, the collector appointed by a priest, whose name is said in a small voice, wipes sweat from his upper lip with the side of his hand and examines Hori as if he were another jar to be tested. Your village is lucky, Intef says. The flood came to the very line of that fig tree. Hori knows this is code. Lucky means the expected measure will be set high. He answers carefully. The figs were sweet this year, yes. A farmer named Hapu waits nearby, hat in hand, hair stiff with dust. He has brought a calf to help measure his life. He has also brought a second bribe of oil in a small alabaster flask hooked with string. He wants Hori to write the figure low so that his family will eat in flood months. I will bring you the best cucumbers, Hapu whispers, eyes steady with a dignity that refuses to kneel. Hori is thinking of Kim's thin wrists, of the coins he does not have to buy extra dates when Merritt's mother visits, of the cough that sounds like his father's bones trying to speak. Intef is watching, and the priest at his shoulder is not watching, which is worse. Hori chooses the middle line, where truth and mercy shake hands. He chalks the measure a little less, but not so far it will call the priest's attention like a flare. He makes his letters precise, the black quiet on the page. He tells himself this, that the river is generous one year and cruel the next, that what he has taken today will be returned by a season's patience, that mot, order, rightness, is not numbers alone, but the balance a man finds when he thinks not of himself, but of how many mouths a choice can feed. The priest's nostrils flare. Intef smiles slowly. Hapu bows once, so small a movement Hori could pretend he did not see it. The flask of oil does not appear, nor does Hori expect it. Some gifts are asked for, others are given. This one will arrive, perhaps, as a handful of leeks pressed into Tia's palm a week from now, and no one will name it. At noon, the gang leaves the shade of the office and walks toward the place where the hillside has opened like a folded papyrus. Stone chips crunch underfoot. The world smells of the inside of rock. The men's voices are low because the work is delicate. Some are smoothing plaster that will carry a sky of blue mineral and stars and gold leaf. Others are carving a line of geese that must look alive forever. Hori writes the inventory of paints. Malachite for green, azurite or lapis for blue when the budget allows, hematite for red, gypsum for white, charcoal for black. He writes the number of brushes and the number of points broken. He writes the number of days until the noble will visit, with attendance and a smile that asks whether the air here is suitable for noble lungs. A painter named Seti pauses and flexes his hand. Write one more day for me, he says softly, and nods toward the figure he is painting, a boat under full sail, carrying the dead man into the field of reeds. My line is crooked when I hurry. Hori stands and watches, his back to the door. The sail is pale, chalk mixed with glue, and for a moment, Hori feels the pull of fabric in a wind that never blows underground. Take two, he says. I will mark it as the day we waited for the plaster to dry. Seti's smile is brief, like the line he draws to correct the curve. The return to the village is a gradient of light and breath and noise, from the cool half-world of the tomb to the plain day of houses and ovens and calling voices. In the lane, a woman is shaking a rug, dust flickering in the sunlight. a boy chases a cat that will never be caught and laughs as if the attempt is its own reward. Hori steps into his courtyard and tastes the air before he tastes the meal. Merit has made a stew of fish and leeks. She dips a ladle to taste for salt, then tips it so Hori can sip from the edge. He sits with his father on the cool side of the courtyard, where the wall is high and the vines make a tangle of leaves. He tells the old man a measured version of his day. Names omitted, decisions softened, and the old man nods like a priest in a small temple. "Keep your hands straight," the old man says. "If the line is true enough, even a god will follow it." Tia brings out a piece of pottery for Hori to draw on the way other fathers might let a child weigh a tool in her palm. He draws an ibis with a single stroke that suggests a second and a third. Tia claps once. "Teach me the sign for water," she says. Hori draws the ripple, 3 little lines that carry all rivers at once. "And the sign for bread?" Hori draws the loaf. "And for our house?" Hori draws the rectangle with the open door. And when Tia laughs, the sound is so clean, he wants to save it for a day when he will need the taste of it. There is always someone at the door. Tonight, it is his cousin Nebra, whose son has been named for a god, and for the way the river smells after it rains, and whose shoulders have been named for the loads they have carried. The corvée lists came. Neighbor says, without preamble, eyes on the ground. They want 20 men for 3 weeks to dig the canal on the far side of the flood fields. My name is on it. Hori knows too quickly what is being asked. The canal is work without shade or story. It takes old men's knees and young men's backs the same way. "Write me down as overseer's assistant," Nebra says, looking up finally with a smile that is meant to be a joke. "You can watch me carry the overseer's shadow." There are ways to soften a list. A man who is owed a day for the burial of a parent might be moved. A man who has been bitten by a scorpion, bitumen still shining on the wound, can be spared without question. Neighbor's hands are unmarked. Hori could call on an old favor, change a character's tale so that a name becomes another name, and no one but the gods will notice. He could promise what he cannot deliver, and hope the canal's overseer forgets 1 man in 20. He looks at Nebro and sees the dust webs in his hair, the place where a rope has left a permanent mark across the palm. He sees the way Merit is standing, as if listening from 2 rooms away, back to the wall, head tilted. "I will do what I can," Hori says, which is a phrase that means both yes and "you are asking me to throw a stone and make a circle I cannot control." Nebri nods, as if he has been expecting that answer since before he knocked. He will bring Hori a bundle of garlic tomorrow without looking him in the eye. Hori will add a small red mark to a name 2 lines above Nebre's, claiming fever. He will move Nebri to the end of the list and write a note that he is summoned to the temple for the counting of cattle, which is a thing that sometimes happens and sometimes does not. After the meal, when the day has found its lower, slower voice, Merit sits with Hori and sews a tear in a tunic. The children draw in the dust with sticks that leave trails like river channels. The old man dozes and then wakes with a small sound of surprise, as if he has seen something from far away and brought it back with him. Hori tells Merit about Intef's smile. She makes a face that means, stay small, do not be noticed. He tells her about City's sail. She murmurs yes and threads a needle in the dim light without squinting. He does not tell her about Nebre's request. She already knows. At last, under a sky that has cooled from brass to blue to ink, Hori goes to the little niche in the wall where they keep the jars of oil and the baskets of dried fish and the household gods carved small enough to stand in his palm. He lifts the figure of a goddess with a lioness head, Sekhmet, who brings plague and healing both, and he sets a crumb of bread at her feet the way his mother did. He says, without moving his mouth, the words that belong to his work. Keep the lines straight. Keep the numbers merciful. Let my hand not be a knife to my own people. Later, when the children are a tangle of limbs on their mat, and the house is quiet, but for the sound of Merit's needle touching cloth, Hori unrolls his day and smooths it with his palm. He considers the times he stood as himself and the times he shaped himself to fit. He thinks of Mot, the feather on the scale against a human heart, and imagines the weight of his decisions like little stones in a jar, some polished, some rough. He does not imagine judgment as a thunder. He imagines it as a question put gently. Did you keep the world from tipping when you could? In the morning, he will rise before the light and take his reed pens out to sharpen them on a limestone chip. He will warm the ink with his breath. He will count the days and the men and the tools and write their names in a hand that knows the shape of each life as if it were a word. He will leave room for accidents and hope and the kind of mercy that does not ask to be named. He will pass the granary and nod to Intef without changing his face. He will see Henu at the well and look at the child's eyes to tell the truth of the fever. He will meet Nebra at the corner where the wall is cool and give him the line he needs to avoid the hottest weeks of the year. And he will accept the bundle of garlic without letting gratitude become debt. At the temple, on the 5th day, during a small procession that most of the city will miss, Hori will be given a line to copy from a very old papyrus whose fibers are soft as a cat's ear. The line will be about order, a sentence that says the world is a wheel and men's hands are spokes, and that the wheel is most itself when it rolls steady, not fast. He will write it slowly, red for the first word, black for the rest, and the ink will shine as it dries and then go dull as stone. He will think of the noble's painted sail, the curve corrected by patience. He will think of the canal's water running where it should, feeding the fields so that Kim's wrists will not stay thin. He will think of Sadie's steady hand and Merritt's steady needle and his father's steady cough. He will think of the little ripple sign that Tia loves, which is how a child learns that names can hold whole rivers. And at night, again, he will touch the palette first, as if asking permission to be the man his hand makes of him. He will lay beside Merritt and feel the day glass over him like cool water. He will be tired in a way that tells the truth, not exhausted by fear, not crushed by duty, but worn smooth by small repeated acts. He will know that he has borrowed against tomorrow and repaid a debt from last season, that he has miscounted in order to count better, that he has kept faith with numbers and with faces. He will know that even in a land where gods are busy and kings do not know your name, a man can make a narrow path through heat and tax and ritual simply by the straightness of his pen. When a festival comes, the Opet, when Amun moves from Karnak to Luxor, Hori will carry his children to the avenue of sphinxes and let them sit on his shoulders. Drums will sulk and then bloom. The bark will sway like a farmer's walk. The priest's white linen bright as salt. People will throw flowers to the river and shout the same 3 words until they are a song. He will write the tallies of offerings, bread, beer, onions, geese, and he will notice because he always notices the moment when the crowd's noise drops to a murmur and the air seems to lean in. Tia will ask what the god hears. Hori will answer, he hears his name said together. He will not say that he hears two, the way a city can become one mouth, and the way that mouth can ask for rain without moving. He will not say that what holds people in this heat and dust and hope is that their small lives fit into a picture larger than any wall can hold, and then the days will return to their regular tilted rhythm. Hori will fix a mistake before it is a lie. He will let a lie pass when it keeps a child from hunger. He will feel the scratch of linen and the lick of ink and the soft, granular edge of bread against his teeth. He will watch his father cough and fold the old man's blanket tighter and taste the sharp sweetness of a date pressed by merit into his hand when no one is looking. He will know his limits the way a boatman knows the channel by the color of the water. He will move within them, not proudly, not meekly, but with that ordinary courage that makes a city stand. If you need a hero stitched in gold, look for him in palace courts, in the stories where the voice turns loud. But if you need the day to hold, find Hori at his board. His reed pen lifts and settles, lifts and settles. His lines are straight even when his choices are not. He is made of habit and doubt and care. He belongs to Horus by name and to his people by practice. When the flood comes too high, he stands in the door and measures what can be saved. When it comes too low, he writes the shortfall in a hand that is calm so that no one will panic. He does not command armies or build pyramids. He keeps the book open and the world balanced enough that a man can go to work and come home, and the bread rises, and the beer is safe, and the children learn the sign for water, and then the habit of sharing it. The city is shaped like its monuments, wide at the base, narrowing as it rises, finished with a point that catches the sun. Everyone lives somewhere along that slope. At the apex sits the pharaoh, distant, jeweled, a man and more than man, whose face Hori knows from statues and carved reliefs, and the names hammered into lintels. The king's shadow touches everything, whether he is in residence or far away on a campaign. Taxes flow toward him like the river toward the sea. Blessings flow outward in festival processions when the god's bark sways through the streets. The throne is less a chair than a weather system. A decree announced at the palace can reach a village as a new measure of grain, a new canal, a new levy of men for 3 weeks digging. For most people, the king exists the way the flood exists. You hear the news before you see the water. Below that high point, the temples are cities within the city, and the priests are their gates and gears. They keep calendars and secrets, stars and stories. They time planting by the heliacal rising of Sirius. They decide which statues may drink incense at dawn and which will stay veiled in their shrines. They own fields and cattle and workshops. They store grain in tall-bellied silos that carry the year's luck in their roundness. Their accounts are meticulous. When a jar is sealed for the temple, the rope and clay know it and will tell it if asked. Priests speak with the authority of the god whose name they say, and even a gentle priest can seem taller than the man he addresses. Hori meets them often, men who smell faintly of natron and cedar, their linen too white for ordinary dust, their eyes lined dark to cut the glare, and he measures his words twice before he lets them go. Soldiers stand between these heights and the rest, not in marble halls, but at gates and in barracks, or far away where the land unrolls toward deserts and borders. In the New Kingdom, they are a fact like sunrise. They return from Cush and Syria, with copper, cedar, lapis, new words, and an extra thickness to their wrists from the pull of bowstrings. Chariots crowd the imagination of boys. Veterans crowd the shade at noon with stories about arrows that hummed like bees. In the city, some soldiers become police, the Medjay, keeping watch over markets and ferry landings, and the roads where a donkey laden with beer jars is a temptation. They are not cruel as a profession. They are simply the spine you feel when you straighten your back. Below them, and sometimes beside them, are scribes, Hori's people, men, and sometimes women, who turn breath into signs and signs into power. Their hands look delicate, but a reed pen can lever a life more surely than a staff. Scribes count cattle in days, translate harvests into obligations, copy hymns, draft contracts, record court cases, and boundary disputes, total the offerings that make a feast possible. They are the gatekeepers between speaking and binding. If a scribe writes that your field measures so many araurai, your field now measures that, and the number is a bridge inspectors can cross. Scribes are the slope where the pyramid's weight transfers to the ground. Artisans and craftsmen fill the middle with skill. Carvers who can make a hawk seem to breathe. Metalworkers who coax copper to take a razor's edge. Painters who can lay a blue so deep it looks like wet sky. Masons who read stone the way Hori reads papyrus. These are the people who live in places like Deir el Medina, the workman's village, where a straight street and a straight wage keep life reliable. They receive rations of grain and beer, and sometimes oil and salt. They take their holidays as a group. They borrow and lend. They quarrel and petition, and go on strike when the granary is slow. Their houses are small and clever, terrace against terrace, courtyards echoing with the same clatter of pots and the same scolding laughter that lives everywhere people live. At the broad base of the pyramid are the farmers, the people of the fields. Their calendar is older than kings. Akhet, the inundation. Water rises. Fields vanish. Fish swarm where grain will soon stand. Pere, the emergence. Mud settles. Green rows are pressed into wet earth with toes and hands, and the air smells of beginnings. Shimu, the harvest. The sickle's flint teeth bite, and the threshing floors ring. They pay their taxes in kind, in sacks whose mouths are knotted like the problem of every year. Enough for the temple, enough for the state, enough for next season's seed, enough for the mouths at home. They are not poor in skill or dignity. They are rich in weather and chance. The river is their sovereign, and it can be generous or spare without apology. Beneath even this, in a softer shadow that is hard to see from the street, are slaves and the enslaved, prisoners of war taken from campaigns, or children pledged for debt and then redeemed if luck and family intervene. Some work in households, some in quarries, some in temples. Some marry into the community and are no longer remarked as other. Slavery here is not a single iron cage. It varies with time and place and the temper of a master. It is also a cage nonetheless. Hori writes their names when he must with the same neat hand, each name a person whose choices have been narrowed until they are almost a line. If you stand in the middle of this arrangement and look up, you will see fear and favor braided together. If you look down, you will see need braided with knowledge. And everywhere, in doorways and courtyards, in temple corridors that smell of smoke and sweetness, in the shade under palm fronds, there is the traffic of belief. The Egyptians did not keep death in a locked room. It sits at table, accepts a piece of bread, nods to the cat. Not morbid. Exactly. Familiar. Life is a rehearsal for forever, and forever needs rehearsal because it is exacting. Every household has small, serious things. Amulets hung by doorways and tucked into children's clothes. A wedged eye, whole and watchful, for protection. A jed pillar for steadiness, so a spine, literal or moral, does not buckle. A tie-it knot of Isis for safe blood and safe births. A scarab to push the sun up each morning, and a heart scarab later to persuade the heart to speak softly when it is weighed. Hori's daughter, Tia, keeps a little reed doll with a coal dot where the eye would be. His mother set a string of blue faience beads in Merritt's hands when she first crossed his threshold as a wife. These things are not toys or trinkets. They are arguments against chaos, as practical as a roofline or a wall. Death, when it comes, is a ceremony governed by hope and money and love, in that order or the reverse depending on the year. A body is washed and dried with natron, wrapped in linen that becomes more than cloth, and sent into the future with the things it will need. Bread, beer, a comb, a mirror, maybe a headrest carved of wood, maybe a shabti figurine to do a dead person's heavy work when the overseer calls. Organs are placed in jars. Hawk, jackal, baboon, human, each under a god's protection. The heart stays because it will be weighed against the feather of Mot, and a person must meet that test with the original equipment. Yet the violence of decay is not the point of any of it. The point is rightness, continuity. The story that began with birth will continue if set carefully in the world's grooves. Temples make the map of that continuity public. At dawn, a priest opens a door, inside a door, inside a door, and sees a god's face no one else may look upon. He washes it, dresses it in linen and gold, sets bread and beer before it, lights fresh incense. He speaks words old enough to have worn grooves in the air. Afterward, the god may be paraded outside to receive the morning, on festival days, especially during Opet, when a moon travels from Karnak to Luxor, and the city hums as if the ground were a drum. But even on quiet days, oracles are given. A bark tilts forward or back to answer yes or no to questions held in a crowd's breath. A priest's shoulder shifts. A verdict is rendered. Is the verdict human? Divine? The city agrees not to pick too hard at the seam. Fear lives alongside reverence, not like a bully, but like a boundary. Hori is not afraid of a sudden, punishing God, so much as he is wary of falling out of balance with the world that God keeps. Mot is order made personal, truth-telling, fairness, proper behavior, the temperate road between hunger and hoarding. Everyone invokes it. Everyone fails it. Everyone tries again tomorrow. Priests are its stewards and its interpreters. Their authority comes from the God, but also from the fact that someone must say where the line runs. If a flood is too low, if locusts arrive, if prices leap, people read the signs like letters and ask, whose fault? What remedy? Priests can suggest an extra offering, a fast, a procession, an adjustment of the calendar. Lunar seats move to keep the feast aligned with the star. They can also suggest to the vizier that a village is unsettled, which is a word the state hears like iron on a stone. Courts sit in the shade wherever shade can be made. The vizier is the king's mouth. Below him, local officials and scribe judges listen to disputes about fields and donkeys and insults and inheritance. Testimony is sworn on the life of the king, which is a way of putting a hand on the largest thing nearby. Punishments exist, and some are hard. But the goal is not terror. The goal is something like equilibrium. A boundary stone is moved back. A fine is levied in grain. A man is ordered to apologize in phrases worked out to fit the dignity he bruised. The law is not blind. It glances always at status and favor, but it is not entirely deaf either. The poor can be heard, particularly if their petition is tidy, respectful, and copied twice. Family is the place where status and faith and law meet the taste of dinner. Marriage is often a matter of moving belongings and making promises, rather than a ceremony with trumpets. Later, there may be a contract written with a precise hand that spells out dowry and property, and what happens if a husband leaves or a wife does. Women have more legal room than in many ancient worlds. They can own property and bring cases to court. They can stand in the marketplace and sell the beer they brewed with their own hands. They can initiate divorce and keep the goods they brought into the marriage. Some women are priestesses or chantresses in temples. Some are scribes. Many are managers of households where the ledger is kept in memory and the rules are enforced with a lifted eyebrow. Children come into this with fury and softness. The god Bes grinning on amulets to scare away the things that scare babies. The goddess Taweret waddling with hippo belly and lion claws to guard the door of the womb. Birth is work and hazard. It is also routine, populated by midwives and aunties and the women next door. Newborns are named with an eye toward luck and lineage and the calendar. Toys are made from whatever is at hand. Clay animals with 2 large ears, a carved wooden cat with a string to pull it, a ball of stuffed linen. Games knit the evenings, senate boards scratched in stone, mayhen and its coiled serpent track, throwing sticks, racing, riddles. Discipline exists, but so do lullabies. Children learn to grind grain by watching and then by helping. They learn to write by copying the same copy 100 times. A scribe's ink is better than a soldier's wounds. A boy like Hori was once a boy who carried water for an older scribe and learned when to speak and when to bow. Rituals run through days like stitching. You step over thresholds with the right foot first. You spit 3 times to cancel a curse, but politely into dust. If your eye twitches, there is a page in a dream book to tell you whether to be glad or cautious. If a scorpion stings, there's a spoken spell to dull the heat, and a paste of ground plants to draw it out. Before you drink from a jar, you wipe the rim with your palm, and then with a corner of linen. Habit is half medicine. You do not say a dead person's name casually, because names are bridges, and bridges can be crossed from either side. If you have no money for a scribe to write a formal prayer, you write one yourself on a shard. Amun, who hears the poor, hear me. The gods are busy, but they are not unreachable. They love attention like anyone else. The economy breathes through granaries and workshops, through barter and gift, through "I'll fix your roof if you mend my fence," and through "I'll lend you 2 hecad of barley until Shemu temples hire workers for harvests and repairs." Estates send agents to buy oil and linen. Prices shift like sand. A goose is worth this many loaves when the river runs high, and that many when it doesn't. Wages are rations for most. Daily beer, bread, sometimes fish, sometimes onions, the occasional treat of meat for festivals. There is coin elsewhere in the world, but here value is measured by weight and volume, by jars and baskets and the muscle it takes to carry them. Festivals loosen everything that is tightened. Opet is the time when gods go visiting, and the whole city becomes away. The festival of the valley turns boats toward the west bank. toward ancestors, and the living picnic outside tombs, with the hungry and the remembered both invited. New Year's Day arrives with the dog star and flood echoes, flowers tied to doorposts, and a whiff of fear. Thresholds are thin on such mornings, and mischief can slip through. Even the smallest households create abundance out of careful saving. Extra beer, brewed days in advance, onions braided and shining, a new coal pot if luck allowed it, a song learned by heart because it costs nothing and buys everything. Now and then, fear thickens into something more. A cattle plague sweeps a district. Children fall ill. A rumor of a decree circulates like a swarm of midges. The ration will be cut, the canal extended, the census repeated. People turn toward the places that hold the biggest promises. The temples answer with processions, charms, adjustments to the ritual order. Officials answer with lists, couriers, receipts stamped with the name of the month and the day. Hori finds himself busier in such times. His reed pen sharper, his black ink heavier. He writes receipts for barley received and barley still to come. He copies prayers with the steadiness of someone walking a narrow wall. He is no one's prophet, but in a world where the smallest scratch can fester, a neat line is a balm. That fear of priests you asked about? It is real, but it is not the fear of monsters. It is the fear of a man who can declare your jar unclean, your oath invalid, your field mismeasured. It is the fear of power that wears linen instead of bronze, that speaks sweetly and binds thoroughly. A priest can turn to a god and ask for a sign, and then turn to you and say, "The god has answered." Perhaps he has. Perhaps the wind sighed exactly when the question was posed. Perhaps he helped it along with his shoulder under the bark. You will not call him a liar, because if he is a liar, the seam of the world you stand on has pulled loose, and you would prefer to step back from that. At home, the fear is smaller and kinder. Merit lays a protective amulet in Tia's palm and says, "Hold this when your stomach hurts." Hori's father coughs, and Hori brews willow bark and prays to Sekhmet with the quiet of someone who knows both medicine and gods have their own ways. When Kem takes a tumble and skins his knees, Merit blows on the scratches and tells the story of a god who fell and was mended, and the story does as much good as the clean water does. The family altar is a shallow niche, a shelf really, with a little lion-headed goddess, a blue faience goddess who is both sky and cow, a sprig of dry flowers, a smear of last week's honey. The house is a temple if you squint. A temple is a house if you live in it long enough. And still the pyramid stands, not only as stone, but as arrangement. Pharaoh at the top, gleaming and distant. Priests, tending the engines of belief. Soldiers and officials creating lanes through which power can travel. Scribes defining, recording, nudging. Craftsmen giving the world its useful shapes. Farmers feeding everyone. The enslaved carrying loads heavier than their names. It is not a perfect system. It is a living one, full of shortcuts and kindnesses, meanness and sudden decency. Hori knows which doors open with a polite cough, and which require a bribe shaped like a borrowed item, returned cleaner and slightly better than before. He knows which priests smile with their eyes, and which count everything, even smiles. He also knows this. The city expects him to stand in the current and keep his footing. Every person is asked for some version of that balance. A farmer is asked to stop up a breach in the canal, even when his own plot is thirsty. A soldier is asked to hold a gate no one will ever thank him for holding. A priest is asked to appear sure even when the sky does something new. A mother is asked to throw a festival when a child turns 5 in a world where not every child does. A scribe is asked to put the number down in a way that leaves someone breathing at the end of the line. These are not dramatic tasks. They are the steady work of a civilization that prays to keep tomorrow much like today, with 1 or 2 improvements you can name. When twilight comes, and the city loosens its shoulders and the ovens let go of their day, the social pyramid looks less like a ladder and more like a pattern. Lamps bloom in doorways. The temple hums at a lower pitch. A soldier leans his spear in a corner and lifts his sun. A priest removes his wig and rubs the line the strap left across his head. A farmer sits and rubs the grit from his feet with a wet cloth. Hori closes the day's ledger, weighs a decision he made at noon, and wonders if the feather and his heart will agree. Somewhere a king hears a hymn written to outlast him, and somewhere a slave sleeps with a string around his wrist that someone tied there because someone else was kind. The pattern holds, the city breathes, and on its breath ride words like old boats. Duty, fear, mercy, mot. Each notched and mended, each capable of crossing to morning. History likes its monuments tall, but the engines that lifted them were low to the ground. If you want to know how a civilization endures for millennia, do not start at the pyramid's tip. Start where sandals scuff dust into a thin, enduring polish. Hori's neat lines are only one thread in a broad weave. Farmers who turn river mud into food. Boatmen who turn wind and current into transport. Masons who turn stone into rooms for memory. Priests who turn ceremony into calendar. Women who turn grain into calories and children into future hands. Officials who turn speech into obligation and obligation into roads and walls. A grand design is only the average of 1,000,000 small fidelities. Egypt is the proof. The pharaoh sits at the apex of that design, a man and an institution, the visible shape of a cosmic job description. In public hymns, he is the good God, Horus living, son of the sun, lord of the 2 lands. In administrative texts, he is a signature and a seal without which nothing becomes real. He is not expected to be omnipresent, only effective. When he hunts in reliefs, the animals are disorder and fear. When he smites enemies, he is cracking the skull of chaos. When he celebrates the said festival, after 30 years on the throne, and again as required, he is ritually made young because the country's health is indexed to his vigor. This is not vanity, it is machinery. The king's body is a temple of public meaning. He is fed with praise so that the fields will be fed with water. And everyone agrees to this because the alternative is to live inside a sky that no one is responsible for holding up. But the pharaoh's reach has a signature you can trace on a potsherd. Grain tallies, tax rolls, labor rosters, court decrees. A decree issued in a palace becomes a note on a stick in a village. Send 10 men with baskets on the 2nd day of Shemu. Royal ideology descends the slope through the priesthood and the bureaucracy until it reaches Hori's reed pen and the farmer's shoulder. And because everything is negotiated, quietly, constantly, the country works. Priests translate will into ritual. Scribes translate ritual into schedule. Soldiers translate schedule into compliance. And households translate compliance into dinner. The distance between cosmic order and a piece of bread with onion on it is crossed by ordinary people every day. Take the temples. They are not only places where gods are woken, washed, and fed at dawn. They are also banks, storehouses, factories of order. Their precinct walls hold granaries and workshops where linen is woven and oil is pressed. They employ singers, brewers, guards, gardeners, accountants. They own fields that need sowing and canals that need dredging. A temple's economy is a loop. Offerings come in as grain, beer, fowl, incense, and metal. Some is spent in the daily cult, some in festivals, some as wages to those who keep the god's house standing. The system works because it is distributive. A ritual performed at dawn becomes a woman's ration by noon. Hori's tablet that lists 20 loaves, 20 jugs beer, 4 geese, for a feast is not poetry, it is logistics set to liturgy. At the other end of the loop, fields breathe on a schedule written into the sky. The Nile rises because rain falls far to the south where Egyptians never see it. The river swells and spills its banks. And for weeks the country becomes a map of islands connected by boats and raised roads. The flood is measured at markers cut into stone, the nilometers, where steps descend into the water's green. Priests and officials read the height and announced the year's prospects like accountants consulting an oracle. Too low, and famine's shadow lengthens. Too high, and dikes erase themselves, and embarrassment follows. The civil calendar, 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 added to placate the gods born on days that don't fit, keeps the human schedule tidy even as the agricultural year drifts slowly through it. Akhet, inundation; Pere, emergence; Shimu, harvest. 3 seasons named with verbs. Life is what the river does. To farm a floodplain that disappears every year is to become a specialist in patience and edges. Egyptians built basins bounded by dikes. When the water spread, a gate opened to let it fill. When it retreated, mud settled in a silk-thin layer, and seed was pressed into it by hand or heel. In dry months, men swung shaduffs, counterweighted poles with buckets, to lift water from canals to higher fields, a simple machine that made a difference one splash at a time. Tools were pragmatic: flint-toothed sickles, wooden plows nudged by oxen, mattocks for breaking clods. There is genius in such humility. It is the kind of genius that becomes invisible when it works. Because grain is both life and ledger, it becomes currency without coin. Wages for state workers are rations, bread and beer, sometimes oil, salt, or fish. Larger or more durable goods are priced by weight of copper or silver, even if the metal itself never changes hands. A goose might be worth so many loaves, a pair of sandals, so many jugs of beer, a hired boat, so many deben of copper on paper. This is why Hori's columns matter. A scribe freezes value long enough to be fair. He is also the memory of a promise. In a world without banking as we know it, a neat hand is the vault. The state's projects, temples, canals, quarries, tombs, are done with a mix of duty and wage. Inundation, months free, many from fieldwork. The corvée summons them to dig, drag, row, shape. The miracle is not that pyramids or colonnades exist. It is that a supply chain did. Stone quarried upriver, shipped in the season when current and wind conspire. Timbers ordered in advance from far Lebanon. Copper tools hammered and rehammered. Bread baked by the thousand. Water hauled jar by jar into the shade of scaffolds. Foremen counting hands. Scribes counting foremen. A smooth wall in a noble's tomb is not only plaster and paint, it is a neighborhood's calendar, a city's agreement about what weeks can be spared, and a family's plan for how to keep the pot full while the strongest back is away. Even protest runs through the system's channels. When rations failed to arrive at Deir el-Medina in a late New Kingdom year, the workmen stopped and sat down inside a mortuary temple, a strike, recorded by a scribe whose loyalty was to the day's truth. The men were not revolutionaries. They were specialists in straight lines, asking that the line of obligation be kept straight in return. Officials brought grain. Work resumed. The state's most stable trick was not force, but responsiveness measured in bread. All of this, the measured flood, the basin full and empty, the ledger balanced, the temple fed, was draped in a theology practical enough to hold. The gods are big, but they are not distant. They live in cult statues that eat symbolic meals and travel in boats on festival days. They speak through oracles that tilt a little forward or back. They inhabit animals marked by special coloring or behavior. They share traits with the forces that shape daily life: the eye that sees, the hand that gives, the flood that nourishes, the desert that tests. Egyptian religion is not a single system. It is a federation of local loyalties harmonized by state ritual. Amun is kingly at Thebes, Ptah craftsmanly at Memphis, Hathor soft and dangerous in many places at once. The pharaoh is the conductor, not composing, but keeping time, ensuring that the morning's hymn fits the kingdom's mood. What is remarkable, seen from now, is how much of our normal is a solution to an Egyptian problem that never quite yielded. You drink water from a tap because you do not want to drink the river. Egyptians learned to drink beer instead, making low alcohol, high calorie, microbially safer liquid bread. You set a thermostat because the sun is merciless. Egyptians built thick walls with small high windows, slept on rooftops, and learned the art of shade. You rub antiseptic on a scrape. They learned plant tisanes and copper salts and honey poultices and the power of not letting a fly land on an open wound. You keep time by a clock that belongs to the sun and the state. Their day was divided by shadows and rising stars. Their year by stars' first appearances and water's patient climb. A calendar so elegant it drifted, so useful it didn't matter. Your paperwork, the contracts and receipts, descend from the problem of memory in a crowded world. We invent bureaucracy because the alternative is arguing every day from zero. Egyptians invented writing to track offerings and fields and then used it to write love poems and laments. They built offices because holiness without accounting breeds waste. They trained children to copy sentences like, "A scribe's pen is better than a soldier's spear," because paper outlives muscle. They never standardized coinage for daily life. We did, because barter's friction grows in empires. They never chlorinated water. We do, because we dislike boiling and dislike dying more. They never broke the flood's monopoly. We dam and drain and pipe, and then spend fortunes repairing the consequences we did not expect. Consider also what we call rights, which in Egypt came more as spacious customs than guarantees. Women could own property and sue. They brewed beer for market and ran households as serious enterprises. Some became priests and scribes. This did not erase hierarchy, but it made family life practical. In our world, we legislate such possibilities to enforce them against contradiction. In theirs, the law recognized realities already present in households and markets. Their solution to dependence was networked kin. Ours is often policy. Neither is perfect. Both are admissions that human lives are woven tighter than a single thread can bear. We insulate ourselves from death with hospitals and euphemisms. They urged it to sit down and taught children its name. The result was not morbidity, but competence. Funerary equipment looks to us like melancholy furniture. To them, it was a toolkit. We invent life insurance and estate law. They invented heart scarabs and spells to keep a name alive and fields planted as on earth. We refrigerate. They dried, salted, sealed. We bury grief in private. They took picnics to the West Bank and placed a cup of beer at a loved one's door in case the boundary grew porous that night. Their afterlife was a perfected version of agriculture, and their present life was a rehearsal for decency under a judge who could not be bribed, because the feather cannot be fooled. Why does the system look so continuous from the outside? Because ordinary people were conservative about the things that worked and creative about the rest. A farmer would try a new barley variety if his neighbor's harvest pleased the neighbor's children. A scribe would adopt a quicker ligature if it saved time, and the vizier's clerk did not scold. A mason would copy a beautiful chisel line without asking who first made it. Innovation spread by comfort, not decree. The shaduf because shoulders are finite. The horse and chariot because speed wins battles. New pigments because blue makes a room feel like air. A civilization lasts when it chooses the tools that ask the least drama from a morning. The Nile's discipline bred a habit of reading signs and adjusting rather than conquering. When the flood disappointed, Egypt did not curse the river. It widened canals, remeasured fields, redistributed seed. When sand swallowed a road, it made another. When a ruler failed, his name might be chipped off a wall, and the work would go on. There is a temperate heroism in this, less brilliant than a single conquest, more durable than a single law. Hori embodies it without bragging. He writes the line, rubs away the smear, writes it again. Multiply him by 100,000, and you have a kingdom. Even war was turned into supply. Campaigns brought timber Egypt lacked, metals it could not mine at home, captives who would become labor. They also brought stories and strange gods who were not enemies for long. A shrine to a foreign goddess might appear in Memphis, translated into Egyptian grammar and fed Egyptian bread by Egyptian hands. The state's appetite was satisfied not only by conquest, but by the gentle violence of assimilation. In such a world, empire is a more elaborate granary. You, listening at day's end, live under roofs that keep the rain out with materials a pharaoh would have worshipped on sight. You carry water in your walls. You banish heat with a box that hums. You ward off sickness with invisible chemistry. You hand your problems to strangers called systems. Egypt shows you what those systems answer. A river's certainty that is never certain enough. A sun that gives and takes without preference. A crowd that must be coordinated without breaking. A God-shaped hunger for meaning that cannot be fed by bread alone. Where they accepted drift and compensated with ritual, we demand precision and compensate with policy. Where they bound fear with amulets, we bind it with passwords and outages and warranties printed in a font no one reads. The problems are ancient. The costumes are new. There is one more link across time that matters as the day slows. Egyptians named their ideal mot, rightness, balance, the thing by which a heart is measured. We have other words, rule of law, fairness, sustainability, but the picture is the same, a feather and a chest full of breath. If the feather rises and your life stays level with it, you pass. How did a civilization keep that feather from flying off the scale? Not by grand gestures alone, by steady ones, measuring the flood without flattery, promising no more than a season can give, feeding gods and guards and children in the same sentence, letting the dead be present without letting them boss the living, writing a number that leaves room for mercy, Hori cannot see the whole of it from his courtyard, any more than you can see the whole of your country from your kitchen. He sees what any citizen sees. The grain jars filled and emptied, the temple door opened at dawn, the smell of yeast, the thud of a gate beam, the polite knock of an official, a festival that lifts the neighborhood like a tide, a sick child who gets well, an old father who does not. Yet when he lifts his pen, he is performing a civic sacrament. He is turning chaos into count into fairness, fairness into trust. Trust is what lets men carry stone and believe it will be worth something when it is set. Trust is what lets a woman boil water and believe it will become beer and not bitterness. Trust is the invisible monument without which the visible ones would be heaps. In the end, what makes Egypt feel so distant is not its gods, or its writing, or its stone. It is its comfort with living at the mercy of a thing that cannot be tamed, and choosing, instead of control, to build rituals and ledgers and houses and songs around it. We dislike mercy's math. We prefer wires and switches. But the river under our city still rises and falls. Prices, weather, mood, and the fixes we adore are only our way of asking for a good flood this year. If you strip the centuries, you and Hori share an evening posture, counting what the day gave, mending what can be mended, hoping your small exactness will be enough to keep the wheel turning without lurching. Tomorrow, the Pharaoh will still be a symbol and a man. The priests will still carry keys the size of paddles. The soldiers will still lean in their shadows. The granaries will still breathe a warm bread smell, even when they are closed. The boats will still shoulder the current and complain only a little when the wind fails. And Hori will still be at his board, copying a sentence about order that he could recite in the dark. Between his reed pen and the king's cartouche lies the strength of Egypt. Ordinary hands, doing ordinary tasks, long enough for stone to learn their names. That night, the temple smelled of cedar and a kind of careful fire. Torches combed the columns with orange teeth. Smoke wrote temporary hieroglyphs on the air. Hori stood just inside the hypostyle hall, where shadow pooled like ink in a well. The bark of the god rested on its stand, gold flaring where cloth fell back, and the priests moved around it like quieter flames. The high door was closed. The world outside became rumor. "Come," said the priest, who had Intef's smile without his sweat. He wore linen so white it seemed carved from light. "Sit." The accounts. On a low table lay a board, a jar of black ink, a smaller jar of red, and a papyrus with a neat grid already pricked into it. The priest tapped the first empty square with a fingernail. "Right. The missing sacks were ruined by vermin. Right. The temple requisitioned the remainder for the said festival. Right. The houses of Henu and Nebre will make up the shortage in an atonement levy. 3 hecat each. And the men will present themselves for canal work at once." The words were soft. The cord behind them was not. Hori felt the reed pen like a sliver of bone in his fingers. "There were no vermin," he said, because his mouth had not asked permission. "Rats leave pellets. The storeroom was swept too clean. And the flood was low." He heard his voice and disliked its steadiness. "If I write that, men will go hungry. My cousin Nebrib—" "Your cousin," the priest said, "has strong shoulders. Strong shoulders belong to the state. And if you write what I have said, your children will receive oil this month. Your father's cough will be seen by the temple physician, not the herbalist with muddy hands. If you do not write it, We shall be forced to inspect your own stores for irregularities. He smiled, as if they were changing the subject to something more pleasant. Ma'at is a balance, Hori. The god does not favor the squeamish incense lifted and fell, a slow breathing. Hori looked past the priest to a door within a door, to the little place where the god was said to sleep. He tried to imagine the feather and his heart, a scale the size of a hand. The reed pen in his fingers wanted to begin, to obey the hand's old habit. He could feel the red ink watching him. He could picture Merritt's face if oil came to the house in a season when it never did. He could picture Nebre's back, bent over a ditch in the heat that eats men from the bones outward. Right, the priest said, and the word felt like a bead pushed along a string. Hori did what his body knew to do. He dipped the pen. Black first, always. He wrote the date, the place, the opening line that made any page honest. He wrote the column heads: received, stored, dispersed, lost. The reed scratched softly. The sound had always calmed him. He wrote the truth as far as it would go without breaking. The sacks received, the rations issued to workmen, the small losses to ordinary spoilage. Then he paused, and the priest's attention sharpened the air. Now, the vermin, the priest said. Hori lifted the pen to the red jar and held it poised. He thought of the storeroom's swept floor. He thought of a child's fever, of Kem's wrist bones like thin reeds, of the old man's small coughs in the night. He thought of the word atonement put on men who had done nothing but sweat correctly. He thought of Ma'at, like a line a mason snaps to keep a wall true. He set the pen down without touching the red. I will write what is missing, he said slowly, and who took it, which we both know you do not wish me to write. Or I will write a deficit and bind it to the temple's own store until Shemu. I will not write a lie onto the bellies of children. The priest's mouth did not move, but something around his eyes turned colder. You are a small man, he said, in a city large enough to forget you. I am, Hori said, but the god's house is not a place for forgetting. He allowed himself a breath. If you wish the bark to answer, ask it in the court tomorrow. Let it say whether offerings taken from the hungry smell, sweet a flick of the priest's fingers, ended the night. Go home, he said. Return at midday to read the accounts in the market. Read them as they are written. He glanced once at the unmarked red ink. Bring your family's ration tokens. Or, do not mourning, carry a quiet weight. On the westward road, a funeral moved like a low river. Men with bare heads, women keening in waves. A bier shouldered with the softness people save for the tired. The air smelled of natron and myrrh, and of bread for the living to eat when the dead had been greeted. Hori stepped aside to let the procession pass, and saw, under a veil of linen, the shape of the plasterer, whose steady hand had made a wall invisible. His wife, Henu, walked behind, a cloth at her mouth, eyes like wells. The boy, who had fever, they had carried him on a hip last week, gray with heat, walked now, holding his mother's belt with 2 fingers. Alive. The mercy stung. The priest, who had spoken to Hori the night before, appeared at the edge of the crowd for a moment, his linen immaculate even beside grief. He touched a jar to his forehead. He said the right words. He turned away, already sealed back into the day's other obligations. Hori felt his chest rise against something that did not yield. A world that could make room for this much care, could make room for one more truth. At the quay, a bark went by with a slow authority. The water licked the stone. Hori put his hand on the cool of a column, as if asking for a last opinion, and the stone gave him none. By midday, the market was a kiln. Bronze rang. Voices pitched themselves to be heard over goats and bargaining, and the smell of onions and warm fish braided itself into something almost ceremonial. A chair had been set for the priest, a table for the accounts, a space cleared by elbows, and the sort of common impatience that can become common attention if turned. Intef stood at the priest's right shoulder, the faint smile back on his face, a weight without visible cause. Hori saw Nebra in the crowd, and Merritt further back with Tia on her hip, her chin lifted as if she could will the shade to reach them. "Read," the priest said, and Hori felt the city lean. He began with the parts that smell of stone: date, place, the names of bins and measures, the list of rations already distributed to the workmen. He spoke the numbers in a voice that was not loud, but that someone could have used to cut straight across a courtyard. He watched the crowd's attention gather, not like fire, but like water in a vessel. When he reached the line where the lie was meant to begin, he paused. There was a drum somewhere, remembering a rhythm and losing it. "In the store of the temple," Hori said, "the deficit is 20 sacks." People shifted. 20 sacks was a small number and a large number, depending on which door your threshold was. "The cause," Hori said, and he felt the red ink in his mouth like a hot stone, "is not vermin. No droppings found, no gnaw marks. The cause is requisition for festivals beyond what the flood will bear, and miscount due to haste." Intef's smile folded like a fan. The priest did not move. "Therefore," Hori said, and he did not look for Merritt because he could not bear to see her brace for the blow. "The deficit will be borne by the temple's store until Shemu. No atonement levy will be imposed on the houses of Henu and Nebre. Men will report to canal work as scheduled by village lists, not by penalty. This is written in red as a warning and in black as an obligation, under Mat, to be inspected at the next new moon." It was a sentence that made a promise and a trap. If the temple fed the deficit, the hunger would not slide sideways into doorways that could not spare it. If the temple refused, the refusal would be a matter of record, a string that could be pulled by anyone literate and bold enough, which is to say, by Hori or by no one. The priest let the silence stand long enough for everyone to hear it. He lifted a hand, palm down, a gesture you would use to calm a skittish animal. "A question for the god," he said. And the bark attendants were already moving, the poles on their shoulders, the little boat swaying like a full bowl. Murmurs feathered the air. A rung of shade crackled as someone leaned against a stall. "Shall Amun accept that which takes bread from the mouths of the loyal?" the priest asked, and the men under the bark leaned without seeming to lean. The boat tipped forward a hair and then back again, a decision as delicate as a breath. Hori felt foolish, sudden, for believing the motion could matter. The crowd believed for him. A woman near the front whispered, "No." The whisper multiplied. The priest smiled the courteous smile of a man who has been spared a worse embarrassment. "Then it is, as the scribe reads," he said, as if he had always intended mercy. "The deficit remains with the god until Shemu. See that the bins are opened." He looked at Hori and let the next sentence sit between them like a knife laid carefully on a mat. "The scribe who binds the temple with red ink binds himself also." Hori bowed, "Because you bow to the knife so that if it comes, it must travel through more air." As the crowd loosened, Nebre's face appeared in the seam between two shoulders. wet with something that might have been sweat. Merritt did not smile. She exhaled as if a rope had slipped off her chest and left a bruise. Intef brushed Hori's sleeve as he passed, a touch like a numerical sign. Small, exact, meaning later. The market resumed its ordinary argument. A bronze mirror chimed against another mirror. A boy laughed at a goat that refused to be led. The torches at the temple would be lit again that night. The cedar would smoke. The door within the door would be opened and closed for the god. Hori felt the heat on the back of his neck and the cool, improbable steadiness inside his ribs. He had chosen the side of the scale he could lift. Whether it would hold until evening, that would belong to the next line he wrote, and the next, and to the hands that would come to take their loaves without looking to see if their names had been written under warning or under grace. In the weeks after the market, the city behaved as if nothing had happened, which is to say, it remembered and forgot at the same time. The temple bins opened. The rations came. Henu's boy put weight on his bones. Nebri's name slid down a list and then off it altogether when another village sent men to the canal. And Hori, who had spoken red into the public air, came to the office one morning to find his board gone from its usual place and a new tablet set for him at the granary on the edge of town, where figures were quieter and oversight was closer. It wasn't punishment, not by name. His wage was unchanged, his ration almost. But the granary clerk who greeted him had Intef's smile perfected into something emptier, and the lock on the storehouse door clicked with a satisfaction that did not belong to wood. Hori wrote the day's receipts in a hand no different from yesterday's. The priest passed once that week, linen immaculate, and paused long enough to admire the neatness of Hori's columns. Maat loves accuracy, he said mildly, as if this were a compliment and not a leash. Keep the red ink for the gods. At home, life narrowed and steadied. His father's cough deepened into something with a rhythm of its own, like a small drum heard from another room. One cool morning, the old man's breath simply failed to return to him. The house made a soft, practical grief of washing and wrapping, of bread for visitors and beer for those who would walk with them. Hori and Nebre shouldered the beer together and crossed to the west bank with the slow steps of men who know the way. The priest at the mouth of the tomb spoke the usual words and meant them, or else meaning was inside the words, whether he meant it or not. Hori placed a crumb of bread before the little lioness-headed goddess in their niche that evening and felt something unclench in his chest. He slept without dreams. Work, which had always been his instrument, became in those months his refuge. He learned the grain's moods, how a sack breathes when the weave is good, how a handful tells you more than a scale if your hand has learned the truth of a weight, how to read a bin slope for the lie it might be telling. He walked with the nilometer man at dawn and watched green water climb stone. He marked the level in black and his private hope in a place that had no column. When a shortage appeared that could have been blamed on vermin, he wrote spoilage and wrote the date beside it and felt the balance hold. When a surplus appeared that could have vanished into festival, he wrote its number in a square no one had used in years and felt the balance hold again. He did not pick a fight. He left no handle for a clever hand to pull. There were consequences, but they arrived in a shape he could carry. The temple physician never came. A neighbor's decoction did the work it could, and no more. A promised jar of oil failed to materialize. Merritt laughed once, short and bright. "We will cook with patience," and bartered for a measure of sesame with a bundle of linen she had mended for the brewer's wife. Tia learned the sign for justice from a copy text and drew it small in the corner of her slate as if she were tucking it away for later. Kem learned to carry 2 water jars without knocking their mouths together and came home grinning, wet to the knees. Nebre, caught by a later summons, served a stint on the canal after all and returned burned and lean and alive. Once, in festival season, Hori stood at the back of the crowd as the bark came down the avenue of sphinxes, the god's face hidden, the air honeyed with resin and song. The priests swayed beneath the weight. The city swayed with them. For a moment, Hori felt the urge that makes a man small, to be absorbed into something that means more than his narrow life. Then he felt Merritt's hand slip through the crook of his arm and settle there with the gravity of a promise. He exhaled and let the bark pass. He was not the bark, not the god, not the hymn. He was the man who kept the numbers true enough for the hymn to have bread and beer at the end of it. It was enough. Years can pass like a boat crossing a shadow. You notice them only when you look back and see that the pier is smaller. Hori's hair thinned at the temples. The reed pens wore down quicker than they used to. The boy at the scales called him uncle and then father, without meaning the second word and without offense. The flood ran fat one year, mean the next, tolerable the next 2. On a hard winter, he wrote an extra line, in red, to remind his future self where the grain had been kept from rotting. No priest scolded him for it, perhaps because a little temple clerk with sore feet had decided to read warning as wisdom. He taught Tia to copy a hymn so cleanly that the singer at the small shrine hesitated and then paid her in figs. He taught Kem to write his name straight so that the world could find him if it needed to. In the end, no decree was issued with Hori's name on it. No statue bore his profile. He did not die for a truth. He simply lived it until he could not. When he went, it was after a fever that came and took what it had come for with the blunt expertise of Egyptian fevers. Merritt and the children wrapped him in linen that smelled faintly of smoke and coriander, and Nebra and 2 friends carried him with the ease of men who have carried more than this. A priest murmured the words that opened doorways, a scribble of birds and ripples and loaves and sitting men, carved shallow on a wall he had once accounted for, did not change, and that felt right. The river went on, making verbs of seasons. What remained of Hori in the world were small things that refused to say his name, but spoke his work. A shard of pottery in a rubbish heap behind the granary, inked with a stubborn red line that shifted a deficit from the poor to the storeroom until Shamu. A tally of brushes and pigments in a tomb's account, corrected in a second hand with a note that reads, "Delay 1 day, plaster damp." A daughter who wrote names on jars so neatly that neighbors asked her to label their wedding gifts. A son who counted loaves fairly and slept well. A village that remembered, for a year or 2, that an honest column can be warmer than a brazen promise. Centuries later, so late that the gods had changed, and the language too, men prying at the desert with trowels would find the heap behind the granary and lift the shard into light. They would read the neat signs and argue about the meaning of a single red phrase. They would write an article with a footnote about a scribe who kept his ink straight, and the shard would travel to a room with white walls where people who no longer feared the river would stand and stare and feel without quite knowing why. the mild pressure of a civilization's pulse against their wrists. Hori's name, if it survived at all, would be smudged by a thumb and lost in the usual way names are lost. But the habit he practiced, the decision to bend a line toward mercy without breaking it, went on. It crossed from hand to hand the way measuring does, the way recipes do, the way a lullaby does. In a world built on floods and promises, this was how a small life left a mark. Not in stone that shouts, but in ink that whispers and keeps whispering until stone learns to listen. What did it mean to be mortal in a place that rehearsed eternity with such conviction? In Egypt, a life was measured not by how loudly it flared, but by how properly it joined the long, patient stream of days. Men and women did not argue with impermanence. They learned its steps. The river rose, the river fell. Bodies failed, harvests failed, kings failed. So they learned to bind what could be bound, bread, promises, names, and to release what could not. Eternity was not denial. It was the art of setting the perishable in a pattern so faithful that time itself seemed to lean toward it. A person knew he would die, and answered not by hoarding, but by arranging. He placed a jar where a thirsty soul might find it. He taught a child the sign for water, so the word would not be lost. He recited a hymn that had carried other throats across the same narrow bridge. He worked, and his work fitted into other people's work, until the day itself felt like a woven thing that would hold even when a single strand frayed. To be mortal in Egypt was to keep faith with the middle, the portion of time between first bread and last bread, and to trust that a well-ordered middle is its own kind of victory over endings. This is why their attention to the dead was not a morbid fixation, but a discipline of love. The linen was clean. The jars were labeled. The amulets were chosen not for glitter, but for grammar. This one says steadfast. This one says safe passage. This one says, let the heart speak softly. They were not negotiating with a monster. They were negotiating with themselves. Be the person, the ritual implies, whose heart can tell the truth in the open. Be the person whose private measure matches the public feather. In that mirror, fear loosens. You cannot bargain with the scale. You can only prepare to step onto it. Paradoxically, this made their days calmer. The test was always coming. The preparation was always now. You and I live in rooms lit by switches and cooled by machines and connected by signals that travel faster than thought. Our afterlives are mostly paperwork and memory, wills, passwords, photographs that do not fade. We do not salt bodies with natron. We salt data with redundancy. And yet the inner calculation is familiar. We still ask, quietly and mostly alone, whether we are the sort of people who could stand before a measure that cannot be sweet-talked. We still line our doorways with small protections, an emergency contact pinned to a fridge, a spare key left with a neighbor, a promise kept longer than it was convenient. We still hope our names will travel kindly in other people's mouths. Egypt's eternity-making was practical because their world refused certainty. The flood did not sign contracts. The sun did not sign them either. So they answered uncertainty with rhythm. The same opening of the shrine each dawn, the same festival when Sirius returned to the sky, the same inventory of loaves and jugs before a feast. You hear this and think, ritual. They heard it and thought, reliability. And you know this feeling, though your calendar has different saints. The holiday that steadies a year, the weekly meal that such and such aunt always makes, the birthday song you do not improve, because it is not for improving. Rituals are tools that make time trustworthy. There is tenderness in how they talked to fate. The gods were large, but they were not strangers. They met people at doorways and quays. They rode in boats polite enough to sway when asked questions. Hori's quiet insistence that the temple account not push hunger into ordinary houses was not rebellion against the divine. It was alliance with the order the divine was thought to want. Mat was not a throne word, it was a kitchen word. It lived in fair measures, in honest bread, in the way a clerk chose to use red ink when red would wound and black would warn just as well. When you look at the stone, at pyramids and pylons and colonnades, eternity seems to mean mass and permanence. But when you listen to the day, eternity means something gentler. A repeated kindness, a repeated competence, a repeated astonishment that the river gives back what it takes. The pyramids teach you about endurance. The marketplace teaches you about continuation. Endurance is stone against wind. Continuation is bread against hunger, again and again. The first dazzles, the second sustains. A civilization survives because its people keep choosing the second. There is, too, a mercy in their intimacy with death. We prefer to banish it to clean rooms with clever machines. They washed it at home and spoke to it directly. It did not make them fearless. It made them fluent. Grief had words, gestures, recipes, routes across the river. The living shared food with the remembered, and by doing so, remembered themselves. When Hori laid bread before the small lioness in his niche after his father's last breath, he was not pleasing an idol. He was completing a sentence that had been started for him long before he was born. The sentence says, "Nothing is safe from ending, and still we keep order." There is dignity in that. There is comfort. If you step outside the house of story for a moment and look at your own rooms, you may find Egyptian habits hiding under modern paint. You label a box "winter" and put it where winter will find it. You keep a list that is boring and exact, because exactness is how a family becomes a ship and not a raft. You tell a child a story you were told, and in your voice lives the faint echo of every courtyard where a scribe drew a ripple and said, "This is water." You think you are nothing like Hori. You are wrong. He would understand your worry about bills and your pride in a straight line of handwriting on a new page and your guarded kindness when someone asks a favor that will cost you more than they know. And so the night widens, soft and sure. The Nile lies under a lid of sky, pricked with familiar fires. Constellations the Egyptians named, Orion as Osiris, Sirius as the goddess who heralds the flood, move with a patience our clocks only imitate. The river makes its old, gentle noise against the reed beds, a sound like someone thinking out loud and deciding on mercy. Far across the water, the pyramids turn from sand color to shadow, until they look less like architecture and more like thoughts the earth is having about how to sit still. They are not loud tonight. They do not need to be. Their edges drink starlight the way cool stone drinks touch. Along the bank, palms whisper, always the same soft conspiracy, a fraying and mending of wind. In courtyards, the day's heat rises out of walls, one careful degree at a time. Lamps settle into their small hours. The cat you met in the morning fulfills the promise all cats make and keep. She patrols the border between what belongs in the house and what does not. The temple door within a door is closed now. Inside, linen hangs loose on pegs. Oil cools in carved cups. Incense sleeps as unburnt resin. A priest sits and removes the line the strap left across his hair, and looks like every worker looks when the tools are put away. Smaller, truer, almost a child. In an upstairs room that the wind likes, a family unrolls mats. No one remarks on the stars. The stars are a given, the way water jars are a given, the way bread is a given, if the day went right. Someone tells a story, not because the ending surprises anyone, but because the middle is satisfying. This is how a clever girl tricked a greedy overseer. This is how a boat found the channel by the color of the water. This is how a king was reminded he was a man. A child laughs in the wrong place, and no one corrects him. A neighbor coughs, and is answered by the neighbor on the other side. The ordinary antiphony of walls. On some nights, the wind comes from the desert and tastes like the inside of a kiln. On others, it tastes like damp clay and green things. Tonight, it carries a faint touch of resin from a shrine whose lamps were slow to go out. You could call it holy. Hori would have called it familiar. He would have returned to his little niche and set down the crumb and whispered nothing, which is to say, he would have let the day speak for him. Look long enough, and the centuries thin. A modern ferry cuts the river with a V of light. A radio blinks in a fisherman's pocket, and a song not yet born in Hori's time drifts across water that knows all songs. Yet the old grammar persists. People still gather at doorways for the evening's last word. Bargains are still made by hands as much as mouths. A child still studies a slate, correcting the tilt of a letter until it stands. In the museums far away, the red line Hori wrote still insists, politely, on mercy. Tourists walk past it to look at gold that has outlived its owners. The shard does not mind. It knows what it is for. What remains, when the story is folded and put away, is a kind of trust. Not in immortality as spectacle, but in continuity as craft. The trust that if you set your little weight on the scale each day, with care, the world will not tilt so violently that your children slide off. The trust that bread will rise if you do the things that make bread rise. The trust that truth, spoken in a voice that refuses drama, will sometimes be answered, not by thunder, but by a bark that settles backward the smallest degree. In that universe, to be mortal is to be exact where you can be exact and gentle where you cannot, and to let the dark carry the rest without asking it for a receipt. So the Nile turns in its bed. The pyramids sigh into silhouette. Palms repeat their secret. Somewhere a scribe lays his reed in a jar and smooths a page the way a fisherman smooths water with his hand for luck. The hour grows slow and deliberate, like a sentence that knows how it will end and is in no hurry to arrive. If you listen hard enough, you can hear the same low sound the city hears when it stops bracing. A pulse in stone and mud and breath, steadying, steadying. It is old, and it is yours. By day, the sun still rules this valley with a steady, ancient ferocity. You can feel its old authority in the way stone flares to brightness and dust turns to gold in midair, in the way a single hour can make linen warm and a jug of water taste like the inside of light. The heat presses down, not cruelly exactly, but with the confidence of something that has always been obeyed. In that glare, the outlines of things are crisp, bread, scored and steaming. Boats slipping along the current like thoughts that know where they're going. A reed pen lifted and set down, lifted and set down. Step inward, and the temperature changes. Temple columns cradle their own weather, cooler by a breath or two, damp to the touch, where a palm rests, fragrant with the ghost of incense that settled and never left. Shade pools at the base of papyrus capitals and rises in rings. Voices soften and seem to travel farther. Here, the sun is a bright rumor at the top of a doorway. Here, you can place your cheek to limestone and feel an old kindness radiate back, as if the building remembers all the hands that have leaned this way before. Even silence seems curated, a careful arrangement of pauses between echoes. Listen, and the city stirs again. The voices of people who have long since gone to earth, threaded into the air so finely you can almost mistake them for wind. The market's bargaining, vigorous and amused. A mother shushing a baby with the same soft syllables your grandmother used. A mason humming the measure that keeps his chisel true. The clear ring of bronze mirrors nudging one another in a basket. A priest reciting words that have taken the shape of the room. And a child on a doorstep reading the ripple sign for water and grinning like he invented it. Even the practical sounds carry tenderness. Grain hissing into a jar, a brush kissing plaster, the faint scratch of Hori's reed across a page where red and black still keep each other honest. These are the shapes the day taught us to touch and keep. The sun's frank heat, the column's patient cool, the low music of ordinary lives. They come back now in their quiet order, like a procession seen from a distance. No urgency, no argument, only the dignity of repetition. Bread and beer, ink and breath, oars and current, a hand on a threshold, and a small prayer spoken not to impress a god, but to steady a heart. Night completes the sentence. The river darkens into a long persuasion, and the stars take up their old positions with a correctness that needs no witness. Pyramids become thoughts instead of things. Palms whisper their soft conspiracy. Somewhere, a household niche holds a lioness no taller than your hand. A crumb of bread is set down, and the day bows its head. You can feel the scale level out, not because the world is flawless, but because people kept placing their small weights on the right side. We have followed one of them to the end of his line, watched the ink dry to a matte truth, and learned what a modest courage can accomplish when it refuses to look away. Now the story thins to a thread, and then to a breath. It leaves you with a temperature on your skin, a texture under your palm, and a chorus you can hear if you stand very still. The sun, the stone, the voices. Ancient Egypt is gone, yet in its silence it still speaks. Let the rivers hush, carry the last words downstream. Let the columns keep their cool for whoever leans there next. Let the voices recede to where voices go when they've said enough. The night is wide and gentle over the water. The city loosens its shoulders. The stars hold their places. That is all.